Thank you so much, Nelson. And this would not be a hip hop journalism conversation without a little provocation, right? So much appreciation. And now I'm going to invite Dean Jelani Cobb up to begin our architects panel. Perhaps unprecedented, I'm going to say unprecedented until somebody tells me any different, group of brilliant editors who really made the magazines that made the culture. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll call your names. You can please come up. You know, we have this amazing group of people that we're very proud to assemble. Bakari Kitwana, Scott Poulson-Bryant, Kierna Mayo, Mimi Valdés, So, you know, it's really, you know, great to have all of you here. We were on the Zoom in the pre-call, and I had to like fight to like keep myself from stopping that conversation because there was so much information there that I was like, no, save it for the panel. So I wanted to just kind of start, you know, by talking about your individual routes into the publications, into journalism, you know, covering hip hop, and the individual publications that you all have worked and edited at. And we'll start with Mimi and kind of work our way down to Scott.
Hi, is this on? Hey everyone, I'm so honored and excited to be here, especially with this group of people and so many beautiful familiar faces that worked in the space. But I started my journalism career at Vibe magazine when it came out just as a sort of test issue in the fall of '92. I was still at NYU, a journalism major, and when I saw the magazine, I was like, this is it. This is like everything that I love. I was just such a big fan of hip hop and R&B and just the culture, because what amazed me about that test issue was besides the photography being amazing, the writing was amazing, and it wasn't just the music, it was the culture, it was film, it was fashion, it was just all these things. And obviously the Source had been around, and I had actually written one article for the Source, but getting a job as an editorial assistant at Vibe was just like everything. And basically, you know, that's where I started my career, eventually became editor-in-chief at Vibe. But it was such an amazing time because I think all of us, you know, we started as fans, and what we wanted to do was just document the music and document the culture. We felt very protected of the art and really wanted to make sure that these artists were considered the stars that they were, because so many of the publications at the time were ignoring them. Like, we were literally just like trying to just prove that this was art, you know, and it wasn't just this novelty. But I'll stop talking and pass it on to Kierna.
I remember Mimi being in the Source office. It's funny when she talks about her career as starting at Vibe, I think of her as a Source Mind Squad member. Let me just
I was hanging around because I knew all the, yeah, I knew a lot of people worked
with
Vibe.
It's important to know that, like, deconstruct any newsroom you're imagining, because that's not what it was. It was the real world before the real world. It was like a bunch of kids from different places in the city with different identities, really, but connected around this music and what was then a, quote, subculture. So it was a clubhouse in a lot of respects. It was like a vibe, no pun intended. You walked in the space and you knew you belonged. I wanted to ask Nelson about like the late 70s, because I grew up in Brooklyn and I remember park jams, and they felt very much like what he was talking about happening in the Bronx. And all these other places. So it just seems to me like the whole 5 boroughs, if you were a young person here, it would have been very hard to be young and miss this thing. It was something that was electric, kinetic. You had to be about it. So that's like an important, I think, background understanding. For me, my journey into journalism started young. I was a big reader, and I loved magazines. I truly loved magazines. I told this story yesterday, but I fell in love with Essence very early. Because Black women, right? And there is really nothing else at that level that is kind of capturing the lifestyle of Black women. But I'm 13, so, where do you fit in that? By the time I got to the Source, I had gone to Hampton University. I didn't get this coveted internship at Essence magazine, and I was like, why did I go to college? This shit don't make no sense. And then my girlfriend was like, I have a friend who just started this rap magazine up in New York. You might want to go see him. Long story short, that was David Mays. I went up in there to be his assistant on the publishing side. That lasted a month. They were like, you got a big mouth, you got a whole lot of ideas, you need to be on the other side of the house. So I found myself in the writer's room with the editors. The other thing that you said, Mimi, that I think is important to not miss is that she said she started out as the assistant and ended up as the editor-in-chief. So this was a world where we made ourselves, we ordained ourselves. The bosses were 25. No one in the office was older than 25. So this was about young people creating a world and determining that this culture was worthy of notating. So, I got to the Source. I was very young. I remember meeting Dream on my first day, and we both had really short cropped hair, which, in 1991 was not everybody, right? It was a small select group of women who were rocking like that. So we immediately knew that we had something in common. And then day 2, she's like, yo, come with me to have some sushi and meet my friend, Greg. And then Tate happens. So I kind of, from day 1 of my life at the Source, was around really smart, provocative, young, inquiring Black folks who were, in my estimation, so much more than journalists. These were like intellectuals that were accessible. And at that time, like pre-internet, you didn't have that, and you really didn't imagine that there would be a think tank of people who looked just like you who weren't 20 years older. So yeah, day 1 for me, right out of college, started at the Source, and history was happening very quickly. This is the 1.5 of the Source. I guess the first part of it was in Boston, but very early on in that office in Soho, we were on the roof smoking blunts and talking to rappers and hanging out with Mimi and documenting a culture. But at no point were we unserious. We were always very serious. And I think that's also an important thing to remember. So that's my entry point. I'll pass the mic.
Ooh, a lot. Let's see, where to even begin? I came to the Source in '95. It's very interesting. I wanted to go after you.
2.5. Yes, right. Because also time is moving like a year in hip hop years is like 7 years, right?
So Kierna was more of like a first wave or 1.5 waves, right? After John Schechter and James Bernard and Ed Young and Reginald Dennis and David Mays made the trek from Harvard to Park Avenue?
Soho.
Soho. Yeah.
Broadway.
Yeah. Broadway, that's right. Broadway was the first office, and we moved over to Park Avenue later on. I came to Source in '95. I want to go back a little bit more in terms of my entry into journalism, though. I graduated from the University of Rochester. I grew up in Long Island. I did 2 master's degrees in Rochester. During that time, I met Hakeem Madabuti, who was a part of the Black Arts movement. And so ended up leaving, I graduated and went to Chicago and worked with Hakeem for 5 years. And Haki was a serious mentor to me. He introduced me to many of the great people in the Black world. And as Kierna is saying, like we were fiercely serious about intellectualism. Mm-hmm. And we were a generation of college students who really understood the significance of what folks in the Black arts movement, but really the generation of young Black people who created Black studies. we were very serious about what they had done and what it meant to us. And one of the things they would say to us was, you're not here on your own because you're so great. You're here because people made a way for you to be here. So that was very important. While I was at Third World Press, I'll just mention a few things that stand out so we can keep it moving. I got to edit a book of poetry that Gil Scott-Heron put out. So I met Gil Scott-Heron at a very early age. By the time I come to the source, I'm 27. So I'm like really in my, I'm like 23 or 22 or something like that at Third World Press. I also, Haki had an enormous library of materials just everywhere, at his home, in the office, in the conference room. And one of the things that they had was back issues of Negro Digest and Black World. So I would spend hours and hours just kind of reading through these things. And what fascinated me about it was all of the people that we saw as great writers by the time we're in our 20s, all of them had written in there. Somebody mentioned Stanley Crouch last night. Stanley Crouch was writing in there. Toni Morrison was writing in there. Like, Sonia Sanchez, Amiri Baraka, so all of these great Black intellectuals, many of whom had laid the foundation for Black studies. They were serious intellectuals. And so that was something that really grabbed me from the beginning. Like, if we're gonna do something serious, it's gotta start with this. Then I had an occasion in which I met Lerone Bennett on the elevator in a building that I was going to visit a friend of mine and he lived in this building.
In Chicago.
In Chicago, that's right. And so I would get into these conversations with Lerone Bennett about how he started doing what he was doing. Writing these articles in Ebony, being an Ebony editor, how the book came to be before the Mayflower, and how it grew out of these articles, and I was like, I want to do what you're doing. Tell me how to do this. And I said, well, what about Ebony? He's like, man, you don't want to go to Ebony now. He's like, you got to find where your generation is, and that was kind of where the light came on. So then I started seeking out ways I could be at the source, and fortuitously there was the infamous staff walkout. I met Dave Mays somehow through some friends and associates, similar kind of pathway, and Dave brought me out. I left Chicago. I came here. In between, I taught for a little while at University of Houston and Texas Southern. And so that was really kind of but I was a fierce reader because the folks of that generation were fierce readers. They were intellectuals, they were fierce readers, and you couldn't really even be in a conversation with these people if you weren't reading anything. So it was almost like, you haven't earned the right to speak yet. Have you read this? Have you read this? Okay, go sit in the back of the room for a little bit longer. And so I think that process and those publications, and meeting people like Sonia Sanchez and Bell Hooks, that was kind of my kind of jump off point. I was more of a Nelson George reader than I was a Greg Tate reader. I just always found Nelson George to be very just a broad, brilliant thinker. I got to know Greg's later, but it was Nelson George in terms of hip hop that I think was, and then it was also Henry Louis Gates was writing about hip hop, and from the jump, I knew more about hip hop than him. That gave me the confidence that I could write about hip hop. And I've told him this, so it ain't no slight, no shade to Henry Louis Gates.
I mean, Skip Gates knew that you knew more about hip hop than he did too.
That's great.
Scott.
That's great. That's fabulous.
Skip and I have had some crazy hip hop conversations over the years. Am I doing this correctly? How do I turn this?
Push down. Yeah.
Hello. Okay. So I want to echo Mimi's words too. Thank you, Jelani, for convening us all together here. It is like a family reunion, a class reunion. So how did I come to this stuff? So according to my mom, I told her when I was 10 that I wanted to be a writer. And from what she says, I wrote my first novel when I was 11. I don't remember that. I remember writing some character sketches. But anyway, so I went to college because I wanted to be a writer, and I went to Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, because they had a great writing program from what I heard. And the high school A student, sort of type A personality in very many ways, got to college and discovered that college was more fun if you didn't go to class all the time and do all your assignments on time. And so after my
any of our students who are in the room, that is completely untrue.
This was in the 80s, so a different time.
Things have changed.
And things have changed. And as a professor, I don't stand by that vibe. But anyway, but I did what I was doing when I wasn't going to classes, and I was writing for campus magazines and publications and newspapers. And at the end of my junior year, I got a letter from the dean saying, maybe you should take a year off. Like, maybe you should go gather your raps and decide what you want to do. And so this sort of moment of real kind of disappointment, I had to tell my parents, well, I think they got a letter eventually, but I had to tell my parents, Brown wants me to take a year off, so I'm not going to be a college student next year. I'm not going to go do my senior year. And I had a sort of lucky moment that my mom knew this woman named Marlene Kochman who knew Richard Goldstein at the Village Voice, and Richard was looking for an assistant, an intern. And so my mom said to Arlene, can you get Scott a meeting to meet these people, because he needs to do something for a year while he's kicked out of school. So college flunk out, ends up at the Village Voice, which was in a way sort of in the back of my mind the plan because of Greg Tate. I had recently read Greg's essay, Yo Hermeneutics, or Cult Nats Meet, one of the big VLS pieces he wrote in the 80s. And so the idea of being at this place where people like Nelson, who I also was reading, and Greg were, just sounded like heaven to me. It sounded like where I needed to be, what I needed to be doing. And so I'm 19 years old. I walk into a Village Voice. I become the intern for this guy, Richard Goldstein, who immediately says to me, I can't write my column the next 2 weeks. Will you write it for me? And gave me a byline. So I was writing about TV and music because this older editor guy says, I trust you, and I like the clips you send me. But also while that was happening, I was sort of lucky enough to, as I said to Nelson earlier, follow him and Tate and Stanley Crouch around and Lisa Jones around, and basically like a puppy begged them to teach me what they knew. The Village Voice was my journalism school in very many ways. And so what I ended up writing about oftentimes were record reviews. And the other thing about the Voice is it was the kind of place where they took the word voice seriously, and they said, go, pound the pavement, find a story, bring it back, pitch it to us. And I pitched them a story about voguing and Vogue culture in Harlem at balls I was seeing. And I wrote a cover story about, which I was told became the first national piece of journalism about voguing and ball culture. And I wrote about it in the context, too, of the hip-hop world I was in, because I saw real similarities between the sort of culture of walking a ball and the culture of sort of black boys and girls walking the streets of Harlem and Brooklyn and Queens, right? It was all fashion and style and attitude. And so that's sort of the direction a lot of my writing went. It's sort of this sort of meeting space between this sort of masculinist sort of tendencies of hip hop and the sort of less sort of gender specific queerness of sort of ball culture. And there was a way in which I sort of made a name for myself, not knowing it, because I sort of found a groove. But I went back to college and then dropped out because the writing thing was so much fun. And I went back to The Voice, and then I started writing somehow for Spin magazine, like record reviews for Spin magazine. And Bob Guccione Jr., who was the editor of the time, said to me, I want you to write a monthly column, a hip hop column for me, because I really want to get more hip hop into the book. and how I was 21, about to turn 22, and I said to him, I don't want to write a column, I want a job. Like, I want like health insurance, and like I want to write profiles. I don't want to just be a page in the back of the book. And he somehow said yes. So between writing stuff for The Source and for Spin and The Village Voice, that led to Quincy Jones wanting to make Vibe. And Jonathan Van Meter, the editor-in-chief of the time, met me for lunch at Time Cafe. Remember Time Cafe? At Time Cafe, and he said, we're going to do this magazine. And at the time, it didn't have a name. And they thought about calling it Noise. And I said, you will not.
Volume?
No.
First was Noise?
It was Noise.
I didn't even know that.
And I said, you are not going to call a magazine about black culture Noise. You're just not going to do it. Not with me on staff, right? And there was a sort of skeleton crew. It was Jonathan, Diane Cardwell, me, Emil Wilbekin, and Ricky Lee. Basically, it was like a very much a skeleton staff to put that first test issue together for that came out in '92. And then the magazine was going to be called Volume. And you can still find somewhere actual mock-ups of covers of Volume magazine that we were going to put out in 1992. But then we found out there was a British magazine that owned the rights to using the name Volume in the States, so we had to find a new name. And it was in July, I believe. I think, yeah, because I think it was the same weekend that Andre Harrell had a party for Whitney and Bobby's wedding at his house. And me and Joe...
I have to say, that's like the greatest preface to whatever else it's going to say.
I mean, well, because so much of these stories are about connections and relationships with people and the spaces you were in. But I'll wrap up. And so me and Joan Morgan and Rob and Ben Mapp were going out to Sag Harbor, and we went by the party first. And I was talking to Puffy at the party. And I actually say he showed me some artwork of his, and I said that has a really great vibe. And we were in the car driving to Sag Harbor, and I actually said that should be the name of the magazine. And we got to Sag Harbor, and I called Jonathan, and then Jonathan called Quincy, and then I called Quincy, and we said Vibe. Like that's what we should name it, Vibe. And people liked it, and I guess somehow down the road it tested well or something, I don't know. But I always tell people, if nothing else that I can ever sort of take credit for in my life, I named Vibe magazine driving out to Sag Harbor. So that's sort of the story of how I sort of got into writing and then got to Vibe, so which led me here today.
It's interesting to hear, how many of the same names come up. Again and again, Nelson, of course, Greg, Stanley, which is a very interesting thing to hear Stanley's name come up, given that, so many people who wrote about hip hop had affection for him, and he spent
and fights with
fights. Like if you knew Stanley, you fought with Stanley, but he was the person who had the least admiration for hip hop out of any of the people that we've listed here, but somehow maintained relationships with all these people.
Though. I mean, kind of a fierce kind of intellect. Like Stanley would do things. I'm sorry. Stanley would just kind of like hit you up out of the blue, like.
Yeah, I mean, he could hit you.
Yeah.
He'd also hit you up. Yeah.
He never really came at me like that. But I remember he would randomly like send me his books. Like I got his book out, and he would just send them, and I just. It was kind of a style of mentoring, that I thought was a kind of a unique thing. So I found it to be interesting. I didn't really like his politics and a lot of other things, but I thought he was interesting as a thinker, and it was a model. Someone kind of like to Ishmael Reed type.
Yes.
Another kind of mentoring type, fierce intellect.
Yeah, I'm sorry. No, Stanley was. He didn't have a whole lot of love for hip hop, but he did have a love for black music, right? So, and there was a way in which I think that Stanley could see in someone like me a desire to give voice to the creativity of that, if not the sort of sonic quality, the sound of it, right? But Stanley did two things. He let me be his assistant for 8 months, where I learned so many things about jazz and about the world and about blackness and stuff. But one day Stanley called me and said, come by my office and pick up some books. I need you to run an errand for me. And I went to his office down on, I think he lived on 11th Street. I forget where his little apartment was. And he gave me this bag of books and told me to take the train uptown and gave me this address on Riverside Drive, I believe it was. And I go into this building, and I go upstairs, and I knock on the door, and I said, the guy behind the door says, "Who is it?" And I said, "Oh, I'm Scott. Stanley Crouch sent me." And he opens the door, and it's fucking Ralph Ellison.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's Ralph fucking Ellison. And Stanley knew that I would probably faint dead away on Riverside Drive if I knew I was going to see Ralph Ellison.
Yeah.
He just gave me the books. And so I'm standing there having a conversation about literature over the transom with Ralph Ellison because of Stanley Crouch.
Yeah.
So all the ways I disagree with Stanley about stuff, all the ways I didn't like some of the stuff Stanley would come out of his face with, he did that.
Wow.
And made me feel accepted in a way that, like, I could do my thing.
I mean, the reality of it, and this is a whole other tangent, like Stanley was a much better mentor to me than a lot of people who shared my politics. And that was one thing I think I had to actually like grapple with. Like, didn't agree with anything Stanley said, but he was also like, you should call this person's looking for writers and so on, in a way that like people who I admired didn't. But I did want to kind of bring this back into kind of your own work. I'm wondering if there's a piece, I know this is like a very unfair question, but if there's a piece that you point to as a kind of particular highlight in your career, something that you wrote or edited, but something you think is really kind of central to your time at one of these publications. And we started last time with Mimi. I guess we can start with Kierna, and then we'll come back to Mimi.
First of all, I'm in the audience as much as I'm on the stage. I'm like, more, say more, say more. One thing I do want to put on the floor for the record, before Vibe began, Quincy Jones called the source. He wanted to buy the source. And there were many, many months of negotiations, and we were all really, really excited about this potential deal. And whatever they offered in the end wasn't enough for Dave and John to say yes, and then we found ourselves in this war between us and this thing that was coming with Quincy Jones attached. So that's a little backstory before there's Vibe.
And someone like me who had friends like you and James and Dave, and it was crazy.
It's also interesting when just hearing you all talk about Stanley, who I never knew, but I thought I hated. Right, but
common
also,
sentiment. Yeah.
In hindsight, I realize how much provocation has its place, particularly when you're talking about Black criticism. So I want to say that too. So pieces that I've written or edited that mattered. I mean, last night I talked about the open letter that I had written to a rapper back in the early 90s. And it was the first time that I kind of took on misogyny and misogynoir publicly, and it became my identity in a lot of ways throughout my career. So I would say that that was monumental, not only in that he lost his record deal and the hip hop community was like, yo, it was very that because it was in your face. And speaking of Crouch, I was very much like what you won't do, and that in the tone of the piece. And I think that carved space for a lot of writing that would come, especially from women, to say, I'm pissed off. And that is how I centered my way of moving through hip hop. Once I felt brave enough to say I'm mad, I'm here because I love us, but I'm also mad at the same time. That I feel like that was very defining for me. Another thing I wrote a piece about C. Dolores Tucker. I don't know if C. Dolores Tucker was a Black woman activist who was very much against the misogyny in hip hop, but it was very reactionary. She was on the side of folks who wanted to ban music, who wanted to essentially get rid of anything that she didn't deem as positive. And I mean, my recollection is a little shaky, but she was a powerful woman. She's based in D.C. And had a lot of civil rights type folks around her, which then put me particularly, but also generationally, us at odds with our forebearers. And I remember feeling like, how do you take a 65-year-old black woman to task, and she's ignorant, like, about what she's saying about hip hop, but she's also not wrong about what she's saying about hip hop. And I don't know, I'd need to go back and check that piece out to see like how much really stands up, because I feel like I was super critical of her. But that's another thing when I think about my own like personhood and coming to be, and what I meant to the culture at that time, because again, it was very early on, which meant it had outsized importance because so few people were doing it, and there were so few women who had a mic, so to speak. But then flash forward to Honey, I think, and even Ebony. I would say I've edited more important pieces than I've written, or more importantly, carved space for things that just maybe wouldn't have been. You know, when we founded Honey magazine in 97, you know, hip hop has progressed. You know, Lauryn Hill is about to become queen of the world. But I was able to send Asha Bandele to Cuba to sit at Assata Shakur's feet. Like, there was no American publication that was going to take that chance or do that kind of work because of my own politics. And again, I mean, this is why it's important to know, this is why having people in rooms that are decision makers matters, because they do bring their selves to the table. They do bring their politics, even when they say they're not. And it does color outcomes. So I'm proud to say that my personal politics had a lot to do with shaping my editorial projects. Even Ebony, 10, 15 years later, when I became editor-in-chief of Ebony magazine, Lerone Bennett being like a grand hero of mine. It wasn't easy to put an image of the Cosby Show on the cover of America's greatest, most venerable black publication ever, and say that this guy is a bad guy. He who is godfather to the Johnson kids, or you know what I mean? Like, it's all incestuous, it's a whole thing. You know, and of course, it doesn't sound like that was news today, but just a couple of years ago, you couldn't sit in a room with grown black people talking bad about Bill Cosby. That's a fact. So just imagine running the magazine that is now challenging black thought and black criticism and forcing us back to the table of not just, oh, we love great artists and popular people and beautiful folks, but what's happening in our community has a net impact on all of us, and we've got to dissect, and we've got to be intellectual and brave. And I feel like I was able to bring a lot of that sentiment to the table, basically with every publication I've ever worked at. So I'm proud of myself in that way. Yeah.
Bakari. And also, I'll say we have to move a little expeditiously because there's something we want to show before we wrap up this panel.
Shorter answers is the diplomatic
Gotcha.
Jelani Cobb delivery. I would, to be brief, I want to build on something that you said, Kierna, and that is the importance of our peers. There's a scholar and activist named Dr. Useni Perkins. He passed recently in his 90s. Lived in Chicago, very influential, ran marathons aside. But he also once said to me that sometimes your peers are your greatest mentors. It's just so important, such an important thing. And the environment of being a hip hop journalist, that's what it was. We learned so much from each other. We brought information, but we also learned from each other. And a lot of those people are in this room. So Smokey Fontaine and Selwyn and so many, many, many others that I can remember sitting around these rooms having these conversations with. That leads me to the answer to your question, though, Jelani, which is some of the pieces that stand out. I would say one piece that stands out is a piece that me and Selwyn wrote together. We went to Haiti with the Fugees when they did the benefit concert. That was I think '97, and that was just a phenomenal experience. It was a fun piece to write. I had never co-written anything before, and Selwyn kind of like guided that entire process, and he did it in such a judicious way that I can just remember he's like, just write your part. So I wrote my part, and then the next time I saw it, he had incorporated he had just woven the thing together in this brilliant way, and he's here, so shout out
a collab
to Selwyn. So yeah, I would say that was a big piece, and it later on got put in Raquel Cepeda's 20 years of the best hip hop journalism. So that was one. A couple others I'll just mention, but not go into deeply. There was a piece I did on Geronimo Pratt when he got out of prison after 27 years. He talked a lot about Tupac, coming to visit him in prison. He talked about things about Tupac that I had never heard people say, like he was the first person that I had heard talk about the kid that got shot in the Marin projects. When Tupac got into a little shootout with somebody and they shot the gun, the kid ended up dead. That was something that people in hip hop really didn't talk about. That was something that Geronimo Pratt told me. And then in that interview, we published like maybe 5,000 words of it. It was like maybe like a 40,000 word interview. So Jelani, I don't know what you want to do with that archiving. And then lastly, when Tupac was killed, we tried to interview Afeni Shakur. That was one of the pieces I was really proud of because I kept calling her. She kept saying no. And then because of my relationships with Sonia Sanchez, and I knew they were close through the movement years, I called Sonia Sanchez. I said, I'm really having a hard time getting Afeni to do this interview. She's basically saying the environment that these magazines created helped to create the conditions that killed my son. And so Sonia said, well, let me talk to her. And she called her, and she called me back, and she's like, she'll do the interview, but she wants me to do it because she trusts me. And so that's what we did. So that was another piece. I want to say it was maybe '97 as well, that I was really proud of that we had done. A lot of the political stuff that we did, again, your peers being your mentors, built on what Reginald Dennis and James Bernard and others had been doing before I came to the source. And so before I came to the source, I spent a lot of time just going through the issues that were done before to try to build on the best of what had been done. And so that was really some of the process, and those are some of the pieces that come to mind.
I'll be quick. When I think about it, when I think about what people just ask as one's contribution to hip hop journalism and stuff, there are two pieces of mine that do come to mind. One is the LL Cool J cover story profile I wrote for Spin in 1991. Partly because it kind of broke ground as a hip hop cover story for a magazine like Spin. And because I used that profile as an opportunity to basically tell the world that hip hop journalism also had space for Black queer men. And I got a lot of shit for that piece because there are literally other hip hop journalists who I won't name today who called me and said, Scott, you can't write about LL Cool J as a sex symbol. Like, no, you can't. And I'm like, but have you seen him? Have you listened to his music? Like, how else does one write, right? But I realized at the end of the day, it wasn't a resistance to me writing about hip hop as a sex symbol, but writing about LL Cool J as a sex symbol from the first person voice of a queer brother. That was the issue. And I eventually got him to say that, but that's a whole other conversation we don't have time for today. The other piece I'm sort of proud of in very many ways is for the first official issue of Vibe in '93, the Snoop cover, I profiled Puffy. I remember that profile. And
if anyone has not read that piece, you should look it up because it is an amazing piece of journalism.
Thank you.
And the LL piece is too.
Thank you,
Both of them.
thank you,
obsessed with
Kierna.
US
That's in
and-
the
oh my
Raquel
God.
book too, the LL
That's
piece.
right,
Yeah.
that's right.
Thank you for both of y'all. I appreciate that. But the Puffy piece was, when we started Vibe, one of the things we didn't want to do, our mandate was to make black folks maintain the beauty of black faces and bodies that weren't getting coverage in other magazines. But we also, I actually said in an editorial meeting, one of the first editorial meetings, that we need to cover black executives, right? Not just the artists, but like the brothers and the sisters behind the scenes who were sort of making things happen in A&R and in the executive suites and stuff. And they, Jonathan and Diane, were both like, okay, we don't know a whole lot about this Puffy dude, but sure. Like, so I basically spent 3 weeks running around with this dude to Daddy's house and clubs and in the studio and to his house up in wherever he was, New Rochelle, whatever he was, and I wrote this 10-page profile of him that I felt sort of was a kind of benchmark moment for the possibilities of what like young black journalists could do in that particular hip hop moment. And I won an award for it, which is always strange to me because I read my writing now and hate it. But yes, but those two pieces sort of come to mind.
And just to add to that, oh yes, clap for Scott. But I was an editorial assistant, and I remember those meetings when you were pitching him. And I obviously, you know, just being a New York kid and being around the clubs and being very familiar with Puff, I just remember being so shocked that they were gonna allow you to do that. And I just was like, man, I'm really at the right publication, because the fact that we're gonna document this like up and coming executive who clearly is, we all knew it. We all knew he was going to dominate culture. So anyway, but
He was a different kind of star,
yeah,
but
different
a star
kind of star.
nonetheless.
And I mean, again, it's just such a beautiful piece of journalism. But I just remember being very proud, being like, oh, like this is the kind
Thank
of
you,
work
baby.
we're going to do here.
I got to shout out Rob Kenner. Rob,
Yeah,
is Rob still here?
I was about to shout out
There
Rob
he is,
Kierna in
yeah,
my
I got
story because, well, two things. Really quick, just as an editor, I always just say I got became editor-in-chief of Vibe at the worst time, because it was when hip-hop culture and urban culture was just exploding and had become a global phenomenon. So now I was fighting with Time Magazine, Rolling Stone, all these other publications for these artists. And so I was like, all right, we're gonna have to shot call, and like 3 times out of the 10 issues we do, we're gonna just put new stars on the cover. So I was just really proud of just that overall you know, kind of decision. But then personally for me as a writer, the story, which is why I was gonna shout out Rob Kenner, who, those of you who don't know, was our like, just every writer wanted to work with Rob Kenner because he made your stories really sing and beautiful, and I could never end my stories. I would always hand in my story, and then I would work with Rob to figure out what the ending was. But Biggie, when we had, I had first written about him in our next section, and because I had a relationship with Maddie C., who had put him in the Unsigned Hype column in the Source, when I got the assignment, I was like, oh, Maddie introduced me to him because I want to make sure, because I also too, you have to remember, this was a time where artists were also very skeptical of journalists, right? So it was like, I wanted Maddie to make that call to be like, I'm good, like he could trust me, like he could be comfortable with me. Anyway, fast forward a year later, Biggie becomes a huge superstar. You know, I'm 24, I get assigned the cover story on Biggie, partly because, again, Rob Kenner, I think, had a lot of confidence in me to take this on. I spent like a week on the road with Biggie, which I don't even think happens nowadays. I don't think you get that much time with artists to interview them. But it was such a beautiful moment for me because I had interviewed him as a new artist, and then now as this like superstar. And again, you know, every writer always wanted to, you know, to get an opportunity like that was a big deal, but it was also like, here was someone that I don't think anyone realized he would become a pop star, right? Like Biggie became larger than life, so that was really a big moment for me.
So I think we have this footage ready. Yes?
There's no time connected to this.
Okay.
Yes, it is. Anytime. No, there is a dope album coming. There's no time.
Hold on, wait.
Why did you Run DMC, you know, 3 months before?
There's no time connected to Biz. Biz is popular always. All the
There's
time.
a time
Okay?
connected.
Now,
I
the
mean,
audience is not
there's
like,
best
oh, the
time,
audience is not
there's
think like,
best
oh, the
time.
album is coming out this date, so I'll
Right,
buy
no,
this
the album
magazine.
is
This
the
date.
audience just know the album will be out in the magazine for 5 years.
There's no time connected to Biz. Biz is
He's a
not
rap
serious.
artist.
Biz, I'm saying, Biz is big. What's with guns on the cover? Why don't you call Diggy
More people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
please.
Gotta say the same thing.
Just call him up.
Guns and
Text. Big guns.
Hey,
4, 5. These have 2.
big smoking 357.
I just say a couple of handguns and just one going like this, okay?
Chris, you bringing in the case of the titles?
Big smoking giants.
We'll have advances this week.
I know the titles. I know.
Dave, we'll have advances this week.
I know all the titles.
Are we gonna have Biz?
That's one.
Biz alone or Biz with
We'll
women?
all have one.
Yeah,
It's
no,
cool.
yeah.
You should put him with his drawers down.
It's a barrel.
down with a
Big barrel idea.
A big barrel is
barrel
suspenders.
idea.
A big barrel around it.
I had one for this cover.
You should have him with some drawers
That was my
on.
John, Chris, and Reggie knew that, right?
David? What?
That Biz is managed by Dan Sonnenberg.
I have David Mazel on.
Phil Bones.
What? David?
Yeah.
I've got the entire source staff here.
Oh, they're all gonna love me.
There's a group called Onyx, and we want to put them on the cover, and certain individuals here would like them to have guns in their possession.
Fake guns.
Why?
Fake guns.
Why?
It's part of their image. It's part of their image.
Their hit record is throw your guns in the air.
Could you please explain what will happen if we do that?
Yeah. First of all, everything that we accomplished out on the West Coast, you can throw it out. And that is getting all the retail authorizations in the mainstream retail outlets.
Bullshit.
Basically, I mean, you right off the West Coast.
Why?
I would guess that about 60% of your distribution will never see the light of day.
Why? Why?
Why?
We just had a gun on the cover.
Because either the wholesaler, the retailer, or the customer, all it takes is 1 or 2 customers to call up and say, how can you have this product in your supermarket or in your convenience store? It represents violence. How can you have it? The place that magazines are sold are not dependent on magazine sales. They're in business for other reasons. They're in business, if it's a supermarket, to sell food product. If it's a convenience store, it's to sell, whether it be beer or food or cigarettes. They're not in business to sell magazines. So you're asking for trouble.
But David,
Basically, I mean,
David.
it's that simple. Whether we like it, whether we agree with it, whether, again, if we think it's right or wrong, it doesn't really matter.
Hey, David.
Yeah.
What examples of chains that we were thrown out of occurred when we put a gun on the cover in November?
Now, okay, I'll add, first of all, when we put a gun on the cover in November, number one, we didn't have a lot of the chains that we have now.
Okay.
One of the reasons we couldn't get a lot of the chains were because their perception is that hip-hop represents violence.
Okay. But what about other chains that we did have? Do we have any examples of feedback, negative feedback about that?
The answer is I don't. No, I don't.
Actually, take a look at the prematures on the October and November. Well, the prematures on the November, and then also look at the October initial returns, like from 30 to 50 days out, and you'll see.
Besides the fact, I mean, let me just put it to you this way.
That's how you look
This
at it.
point in time, are you willing to run the risk? Because what you're talking about is you're going to do that on the cover, and all it takes is a couple of deauthorizations, and Vibe is coming out in September. Is that what you want?
Exactly.
What?
You made your
No one
point.
answered,
You made your
no one
point.
answered, but we got you.
Thank you, David. I'll call you later.
Okay.
Sound like a David. How about that money?
So what'd you have for lunch today?
Yeah.
We get you back up here for the Q&A part. So I should say, I want to say before we start that is footage from a never completed documentary about the source that Dream Hampton started in 1993. And a million thanks to her for letting us use that footage. And the documentary was never completed because she didn't get the level of access that she wanted, to be able to tell the story. And so she sent us 4 hours, a little bit over 4 hours of footage. And, there were so many gems in there, but I just thought that was so indicative.
Kierna, you had never seen it, right?
Oh, no.
Some context in terms of the numbers.
Mike.
Sorry. I'm talking to you and not the mic. One thing in terms of the context, in terms of the numbers, like when I went to the source in '95, the magazine sold per month on newsstands was around 70,000. By the time I left the source 4 years later, it was 350,000 on the newsstands, over the counter, direct. At its height, it was 400,000. So Ed Young, who's in there with the kind of brown rust, whatever you want to call it, sure, he was the head of distribution. He went to Harvard also, and he had spent time, I think I told you this before, working with a professor who had been at Harvard, who then was a part of the New Republic, and worked with him in distribution, and then brought that kind of
Marty Peretz.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right. Yeah. So I just wanted to give that context in terms of the distribution. For the source, the over-the-counter sales was the biggest thing and made the source the top-selling music magazine in the country, ahead of every music magazine in
including
the country.
Rolling Stone.
Including Rolling Stone and Spin. So that's an important part of the context.
So we have a little bit of time for questions from the floor. He comes to the microphone, and so we're running a little bit over time. So the microphone is in the center aisle. And so I think we can get to 2 or 3 questions if we add. So I will ask one thing because of time, that only one person respond to each question.
Sure. First of all, I'm Oliver Wong. I'm part of the West Coast contingent here, partly because of that. Thank you. I've probably written for a lot of people in this room, but because I was never based in New York, I never got to meet you. So real quick, thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to write for you. And sincerely, my apologies for having to edit my copy. So just want to keep that real. I really love hearing how people get their start. And that was one of the first questions that was put to the panel. This room is filled with a lot of old heads, but also a lot of newer people hoping to get to some place where y'all have gotten. Advice that you would have, however modest, how can someone today get their foot in the door to do the stuff that all of you have had the opportunity to do? And it doesn't have to be in print necessarily, because obviously a lot of other mediums that we can explore, but what would a suggestion from anyone on the panel for that? Thank you.
That's so hard. Okay, quickly. I'll say this, because this is true. Serendipity is real, right? Like there's a universal thing too at play when you find yourself someplace, but it wasn't exactly a plan. The thing is, can you show up as yourself when serendipity happens? I'll speak for myself, but I know these people on the panel. In as much as we've been trained and had relationships, there's something to be said about knowing who you are. I hate to be cliche, but when you're a young person, that's not always easy to feel like I believe that me being here matters. Like I actually believe that these people, older than me, richer than me, smarter than me, whatever than me, need me. If you can try to tap into a little bit of that, you already have a leg up on the other humans in the room, because everyone's dealing with insecurity, especially when you're first beginning your career. So wherever you go, whatever room you find yourself in, you don't know if there's a person in that room who is going to be so impressed with you that next week when they're in another room and they need someone who thinks like you, calls you. You know what I mean? So there's a part of this that you can't plan, but be prepared to impress everyone all the time, namely yourself. That's really my most true piece of advice.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the incredible knowledge you shared and your experience. Touching a little bit on that from the perspective of I'm a Columbia journalism student. As we get to transition into these professional roles once we graduate, you talked a lot about the context that you guys were coming in with, you know, all these historic publications and institutions that fostered hip-hop journalism when you guys came about. You know, talked about learning from, you know, these black scholars, intellectuals, and when you think about it, you guys were at like the apex of hip-hop, like really emerging, obviously, so it was a very special time. But when you think about the landscape that you guys were able to work in, like you talked about, like the freedom you had as young journalists in those newsrooms, when you think about, you know, the landscape that you guys were able to do your work and do such incredible hip-hop journalism, what are your thoughts on the current landscape with young black journalists, young hip-hop journalists today, and what would you like hope that they could, you know, collect from your time?
Mike?
Wow, that's a big question. Thank you for that question. There's a way in which I would answer your question from the perspective of someone who spent a lot of years working as a journalist, an essayist and critic and stuff, and who now teaches writing to young people. I teach a class in Michigan called Flawless Freedom Formation, writing about race, gender, and popular culture. And I use it as a class, use the classroom as a kind of laboratory for students to really experiment with personal writing and personal essays. And what you just said, Kierna, actually really resonates for I think for what my students are doing, sort of trying to be as, I'm gonna use a word I don't really love, authentic as they can. I said earlier the thing about the Village Voice was they really do emphasize voice. And I find myself as sort of post-journalism career, current professor who also teaches writing, and fan and reader, how often I am listening for and looking for voice when I read a new young writer, right? And that really compelling feeling where I can close my eyes and hear the voice so much so that when I read them again, I'm already familiar with them in a way. So there's a way in which that's what I always encourage, right? Like, find that voice, find the thing that makes you sound like you. And I've found like I'm reading now, particularly in my students, like these kids who who are really invested in that kind of authenticity. Quick thing. When I was about 20 years ago, a book of mine came out, and I did a talk at Howard University 20 years ago. And I met this young writer named Michael Arsenault. Are you familiar with him at all? And he told me, he took me out for coffee after my talk about my book, and he said, I'm gonna be a writer like you one day. And I said, of course you are, brother. Like, of course you are. And now his third book is about to come out. Yeah. And I think the first one's called I Can't Date Jesus, I think, or that was the second one. But anyway, he's brilliant, and his voice is just sterling and real and authentic, right? And it's for some reason he always sort of is active in my mind as someone who I saw grow up, right? And sort of be very specific and very authentic about his own experience and using that to inform the things he wrote about. And so that's what I oftentimes look for in young writers who either want advice from me or want to learn from me or take a class with me, or when I go on the internet and read stuff, I check for the sound of that voice that feels real and honest and felt and sort of has real sort of richness to it. If any of that makes sense to what you're asking. So,
thank you, sir.
And
I want to add something to that really quickly. Just make sure that you're curating your social media really smartly. Like, you only have 24 hours in every day. You just simply can't be on TikTok for all 24 of them. So what you do have to do, though, is make sure that you're becoming smarter. You should be sharper. You should be better by way of what you're taking in every day, not just entertained. You should find a way to kind of push back, like use social media to make your knife sharper.
And you get the last question for this panel.
Great. Thanks for being here. I had a question about maybe something you said. You mentioned how you were, at the time, a lot of artists were skeptical of journalists. Can you talk a bit more about the process of gaining that trust and where you think that relationship is today?
That's a great question. I think we all probably have a different perspective of how we all did it. I think for me, when I got to Vibe, and Scott, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but like I was like the hip hop kid, right? Like I went out to like 3 or 4 clubs every night. Like I was just so well versed, and I was such a quote unquote expert about it. And I think that's what helped me gain the respect of not only my fellow, my coworkers, but A&R execs, artists. Like I just knew this music inside out. I did not just know the artist. I know who produced the music. I know who directed the music video. I know who A&R'd it. Like I literally just studied everything. And I think for me, that's what helped gain the trust that when I did sit down to interview someone, or if I was trying to get someone for, whatever, article in the magazine, or just kind of help with stuff, because I just remember sitting in those early editorial meetings, and if somebody would mention some artist, I'd be like, oh, I know them. I know that. I know somebody who's a friend with them, or I know the A&R. I know that. And I think that's what helped, just being so well versed in the music. And I think that's really ultimately what helped me gain people's trust. So, yeah.
So I want to say thank you. I mean, I really feel like there's like another hour of conversation we could have. But thank you for sharing your recollections, your insights, your perspective with us this morning. Can we have another round of applause for them?
Thank you.